Talk Shoes.
Recorded live.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil. Welcome all to another week of 42 Minutes, this one being episode 13. And again, my usual co-host Will is out on sync assignments, and I'm joined by Alan Abadessa and a very special guest this week, which I will let Alan introduce.
Thank you. It's good to be back with you, Doug. And today we have with us Neil Kramer, who I'm just really honored to have with us. He was kind of to contribute to the Sync book and join us today. So, Neil, welcome to the call.
Hey, guys. Good to be here. Thanks for inviting me along.
Absolutely. Now, Doug, you started this off with a quote about death, and that's because this is the 13th episode, and 13 being Death in the Tarot, correct?
This is correct. Yes. So the 13th episode, I think this means that we're talking about death this evening. And this is interesting that usually the show comes to you in the morning, and this episode is coming to you at night. So is the death card, what does that mean? Is it a literal death, or is it a transformation? And that's what the show is doing this week.
Absolutely. And that's something we had started to mention the movie Brazil last week. It came up. And the ending of the movie is something Doug and I have discussed as to what actually happens. And
before we get into that, should we say, did you... Well, first, I just want to say how much I appreciated your piece in the Sync book, Neil. I thought it was fabulous.
You're welcome. Thank you.
How did you, Alan, as the editor of the book, how did you get in touch with Neil? How did this happen?
I first heard Neil on Red Ice, I guess like 2 years ago, and then I followed some of his work and was just really impressed. And I just I guess it was towards the end when we, as I've mentioned a number of times, the Sync book just sort of snowballed from a very innocent little idea of, hey, what if some of us all wrote 10 pages to snowballing into a real something. And when we decided to expand the book and a little bit more towards the end, I just reached out to Neil and asked him if he would contribute one of his, he writes wonderful essays on his website, that's neilkramer.com, and I asked him if he would be willing to contribute one of those essays to our book, and he said yes.
Great.
Now, the reason I mentioned Brazil is because one of the first times I heard Neil speak was in a Red Ice episode where the sort of topic was the movie Brazil, or he used that as a launching point, and I thought maybe Neil would want to speak to that a little bit of how, a few things, essentially maybe we can get to the ending of the story of do we escape, what is quote-unquote escape, death in the tarot also being change, what is the true transformative process, but also maybe a little bit of where I'd really like you to start. I think many in synchronicity who have come to really study synchronicity got into it and through what Neil calls a dark unveiling. And I was wondering if, Neil, if you would introduce that aspect a little bit to start us off.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the dark unveiling, I presented various models and ways of thinking about the world over the past 5, 6, 7 years. And one of the stages in one's personal awakening process, if I can use that rather grand word, or expanding consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, one of those stages is undoubtedly an unveiling stage where, as you begin to realize that there is more to life than the mainstream consensus reality tunnel suggests there is, one of the most intriguing aspects of that initially is the dark unveiling. That is the sort of shadow side, which is to some degree, alchemically speaking, a reflection of what's inside us. But it means conspiracy to most people. But as you begin to push through that, you realize that it is a very archetypal shadow, as Jung might describe it, in that it's everything that is unconscious in the world. That does mean all the kind of psyops and destructive events and unpleasantness around the world. And people get drawn into looking at the sort of David Icke and Alex Jones territory and realize that a lot of this stuff is real. It's not really open to sort of debate and whether it's actual or not anymore. I think with any sort of degree of personal study, which, there's quite a lot of that required, you soon come to the conclusion that there is a sort of cabal of people going around trying to steer events. And what I have found is that group of people, rather than it just being like the Illuminati or the New World Order or some kind of slightly superficial layer, is really what I would describe as the empire, which is one empire, which is unceasing really since about 8,000 years ago at minimum. And so there's always been the empire, and it was Egyptian and Roman and Mongol and British and American, and it's all the same thing. And when you look at the dark unveiling of life, whatever level you go to and however deeply you want to penetrate that, what you're really doing is you are investigating the sort of forensic trail of the empire and how it's moved through human society over the millennia. And you come to a point where you realize that not only is it actual and it has veracity, as I say, but it's also something that is very old. And I think a lot of pure conspiracy researchers kind of neglect to go into that in any great detail. And a few people may say, oh yeah, there's Sumerian aspects and, off-world aspects and so on, but they don't really go into it. And I think that even looking at the modern sort of mediaplex, which I know is quite a heavy feature of synchro-mystic study, if you like, you can start to see the sort of little tentacles of the empire, and it is very fascinating. But the real juice of it, the real value of it, is that there comes a point where you realize that it's actually an aspect of yourself, and it's actually a reflection of consciousness. And that leads to a rather classical realization, which is that, as in alchemy with Hermes Trismegistus, there's no real difference between the outside and the inside. So not just as above, so below, but as within, so without. So the wise student realizes that those dark unveilings really are a reflection of what's inside. And that's the value of it. And the transformative aspect is once you realize that, you don't get hung up in this kind of negative vortex where you just think, well, all is lost and the empire's kind of supremely powerful and there's very little we can do and we're all kind of in a bit of a up the creek without a paddle situation. It's not like that. It's a very classical kind of Hindu realization, really. So that's what that is. And it can take many forms and many aspects, very practical, geopolitical study and very esoteric study in terms of secret societies and non-human intelligence and so on and so forth. So those different layers of the shadow, again, if one can keep still and focused and balanced and strong going through that, it does lead to a good place. And as I say, it's a very archetypal journey, really. It's the fool's journey in tarot, if you want to put it that way, and that you start from that point of ignorance and you start to realize that everything isn't as we thought it was. And initially, that feels bad. But after a little while, after a little study and a little kind of soul searching, you start to get the attainment, the conscious attainment that is actually part of your own journey. It's not just stuff out there on the platform of the world that's happening and you're looking at it. It's actually part of you. I think that's the spiritual value to it.
Wonderful.
So then, does the individual transform the empire by transforming themselves, or is that irrelevant? You know, the empire is always going to be the empire, and the individual needs to go on their journey and break through.
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it? I think that brings one to the very deep and important topic of free will. And essentially, without free will, you are at the mercy of the empire, and everything that you do, every time you vote and, you know, fill out a form for the IRS or go and get your driving license or whatever, you're playing the empire's game, really. And if you're hoping that Ron Paul's going to make everything better, or there's going to be some sort of Marxist revolution or something, you're still playing the empire's game, and it looks rather, you know, difficult. So the transformative element of that is in realizing from a very high level that the empire serves a kind of purpose of what you might call as a negative attractor. So it pushes out the polarity of conflict to a point where it creates change, it accelerates change. So in Hindu terms, you know, many people would be familiar with the Yuga cycles, where you're at a point where there's more negative polarity than there is positive. So from a human face on the map type perspective, that looks a bit bleak, and you might think, well, it might be nice to live in a time where it's very positive, you know, the golden age or whatever. But actually, it's where that Kali Yuga cycle completes, where you reach optimum negative polarity, that you also reach optimal potential for change. So really, it's kind of like a game in that even the empire is playing that game as well. And strictly speaking, there are no good guys and bad guys. But again, that's a transpersonal view. And, you know, if you're getting a boot in your face and your teeth knocked out, you do well to keep that view in mind, of course. So if you're right up against the edges and you feel that abrasion, then you quickly forget that. But if you can create a space for contemplation and you can zoom out from your own personal affairs for a moment, then you begin to see that this empire, the only thing that's unusual about it is that it's kind of plugged in to Maya, the illusion of form. And what was designed as a teaching mechanism, i.e. to penetrate the illusion of form, has been sort of hijacked a little bit. And that Maya construct, which I call the distortion, has become very inorganic. So a few thousand years ago, I think it was very natural. And now it isn't. It's very synthetic, and it's very much conditioned and programmed and constructed and so on. And yet again, although that seems a little bit kind of cynical point of view, it actually has the overall effect of increasing one's potential for realization and attainment and growth and awakening and enlightening and illumination and all that stuff. So, you know, it's kind of like the Empire in the Star Wars movies. You know, when it gets really big and really mighty and really powerful and all looks lost, suddenly there is the greatest potential for the new paradigm to break through. And that cycle is an old one, and it happens every 25,000 years, we could say. And I think we're coming to that point again where new paradigms are beginning to surface, and they're there now. It's not some magic switch that gets thrown. They are there now. But you can't see it when you've completely immersed in the distortion. You have to get out into organic, true reality, and that is a process of conscious purification, which is what my work is about, really. And you know, I have a book coming out in the spring, and that's what that is about, to say, let's understand what the distortion is, let's understand the systems of control. Now, get that out of the way, and then we can realize that that is a kind of springboard for something pretty exciting, actually. So I have a very optimistic view of it. That sounded like a small dinosaur in the background. Then what was that?
Right. Sorry. It's cute, Velociraptor. Yeah. One of the things we talked about last week is the idea of, so when you talk about things like this, you end up abstracting things, and then this leads to the idea of like a sync rapture, where when you do transform, you know, where do you find yourself at the end of that? Is it you're just pure light fluttering around in you know, a blissful tree, or is it, you know, how do you view that? Do you view it more
that sounds pretty good to me, actually. Yeah, I'd go with that. No, I think.
I mean, are we very food and, you know, scratching around in the dirt at the end of this?
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying. I think that's a very sort of binary way of looking at it, that you're either in the 3D platform or you're off it. And that leads into the notion of how the architecture of this place hangs together. And for me, the way I consider that, the way I view that, is to say that there are different densities of being, rather than saying dimensions, which can lead us into thinking very spatially. We could say that there are different densities of being. So let us say, for example, that a gas or a liquid is a first density consciousness. You know, a wolf or an eagle is a second density consciousness, and a human being is a third density consciousness. And I propose a model where there are 7 levels of this, and it could be 9 or 11 or 13, but it's kind of like chakras or whatever. You can collapse it down into 7 key areas. And I think the game, really, of consciousness is to move from the first density to the 7th density and go through that growth process. And all the time, it's a process of distillation and refinement and purification. And you can't really proceed until you've learned the lessons that have dominion in your density. So what transition means, which is obviously represented by 2012 in many people's minds, that transition reflects a movement of consciousness where there is, for the first time in a long time, a number of conscious beings who are Homo sapien, who are beginning to shift to 4th density consciousness. So it's a gear shift, it's a movement, it's not an absolute way you just blip into being a light being. You move to a different stage of being, a different kind of ultra-terrestrial existence, which again is totally organic, totally natural, happens all over the universe. But in our little quadrant here, it's not happened before, it's novel. And I think that's what the change is, because the old paradigms that are anchored into 3rd density being can't really move forward with that, because it's very much about possession, and it's very much about form. And if you're into those 2 things, although that might have been appropriate at one time, it's starting to become not appropriate anymore. So the whole solar system presents itself as an engine for us to get maximum sort of slingshot on that movement. And you can see it everywhere. And of course, I don't need to tell you guys that particularly in the media, you can see that coherence, that super coherence, as Irvin Laszlo calls it, formed in where there's any sort of complexity. So you can see it in tea leaves in a cup, or you can see it in text in a movie, or you can see it in cloud formations. The Druids used to have this cloud divination called Neladracht, which was using the complex movement of clouds to determine what's going on around the planet. And any sufficiently complex system, even the lines on your hand, can be used to do that. And when a maximum point of acceleration is reached, the coherence becomes extremely tight, and you can start to see those synchronicities gather together. And I think that's what, for me, is fascinating about this synchronistic observation that we call synchromysticism, which is that it's becoming more and more self-evident. And the old kind of question of, well, you can see it in everything if you want to, that's the whole point. Yes, you can. And that's what's most fascinating about it, that rather than being in a universe where one struggles to find meaning, it's quite the opposite. We're actually in one that is absolutely saturated in meaning. And all that we do is put our spotlight of consciousness on a particular trail of that, and we describe or articulate a particular journey for that.
Yeah, I've been sort of, over the last year, I've been referring to synchromysticism as fractal cartography, sort of mapping out the yeah, I mean, it's, exactly as you said, you can focus in on any point and you're going to notice the same patterns and the same interconnectedness no matter what you choose to be your focal point. And I think it just over and over again sort of reminds me and reassures me that, yes, this universe is completely filled with meaning at every angle. Even the things you thought were meaningless or trivial or inane, even the trash, it's like the things, we started off with the dark unveiling. The pop culture, in a lot of ways, is very dark, but then we find that even within the machinations of this empire, we're finding that same evidence of this fractal, holographic nature that we're all repeating, or we're all echoing aspects of each other.
Yeah, you do, and definitely the dark aspect of the empire, again, from a high perspective, is a gift, because it's really the universe saying, okay, guys, you're not choosing to look at the shadow inside yourself, so we'll do you a favor. We'll present it in the external circumstances of your world. Then you'll not be able to ignore it anymore. So the whole point of that cycle is that the longer we ignore the shadow and the longer we leave our sort of long overdue rewiring job, the longer we put that off, the harder and more dense that exhibits itself in the outside world. And so, you look at the sort of GOP political race with Romney and Perry and goodness knows who and all these people battling against each other. And it's totally absurd, and it's really kind of dispiriting if you were to believe for one moment that that was the best alternative to what politically is happening in America at the moment. And that's a gift, because it says, well, this is how silly it gets when you ignore your own shadow work, when you ignore your own polarity. And the only thing that's a bit crap about humans is that there's been a tendency for the last few thousand years to not do the inner work. So more and more, I think the smart person is beginning to realize that. And the more ridiculous and crazy and funny outside circumstances get, the more that gifts you the opportunity to say, okay, hang on a second. All right, I'm starting to see this now. This is about growth, isn't it? This is about presenting to you, mirroring to you something that you don't want to look at inside, so it becomes externalized. It becomes projected outwards. But really, the source of that problem starts inside. And so you can't just fiddle about with the outside symptoms. You have to go to where that projection emanates from, and that's from us. No one else, from us. And that's the alchemical aspect of this, because particularly the sort of medieval alchemists and the early Victorian alchemists in Europe, they knew this stuff inside out. This stuff was passed down for generations, and much of it needed to be hidden because the Christian and even the Buddhist religious march in the East and West crushed that knowledge. They didn't want that knowledge in the mainstream, and so it became hidden in what we now call secret societies. And those kind of repositories of knowledge are slowly leaking out into the mainstream. And the old laws of this has got to remain absolutely secret and absolutely watertight are changing now, because the rules of the game are changing. Nobody's going to get necessarily the head lopped off anymore, because certainly in the West, the religious dominion is much less. And it's appropriate for that information, for that sacred knowledge to actually come out now. But it comes out in a way that is most relevant and most prescient for the times. And so, of course, we find it coming through technology and through the media and through art and through music. And that's the value of the sort of pioneering synchromystical study, in that is what is being tracked by, in this particular case, 26 guys who you've gathered together. And of course, a lot more people are doing it. But if you want a real, 101 head start crash course in brain surgery, this is it. That's where you find out how it works. And the beauty of it is, and again, you guys will know this, is that as soon as you click with how it works, you can go out and do it on day one in your own life and track that movement of consciousness and that growth accelerator.
Where do you think this kind of fall, where's the separation, why did that happen, do you think? Is it just the normal progression of the yugas that we became more and more isolated from our spiritual core? The reluctance to do the shadow work that you said.
Yeah, good question. That's important. I think there's a personal answer, and there's also a non-personal answer. The personal answer is that when we show up on this planet in the 20th century or the 21st century for newcomers, you show up in a place where there are no tools, and there's no education, and there's no awareness whatsoever of what the inner work is and what its value is and why indeed we should do it. So if you find yourself being born in Europe or America in particular, there's no productive Protestant purpose at all for doing the inner work. All that matters is that you resource yourself well, and that's the game in the mainstream construct. Resource yourself well, have nice things. That's the game. And
right.
So at some point, you have to step back from that, even from your own friends and family and colleagues and so on, who are all doing that, and say, hang on a second, there's something wrong with that. I don't think that's what we're supposed to be doing here. So at the personal level, you face the immediate challenge that you don't have any support or knowledge of that whatsoever. And even the guys that, people like ourselves speak to all the time, at some point they've all had to go through that realization and think there's something else going on, there's something not right. It's a bit of a sort of Thomas Anderson moment where you realize there's something wrong, but you're not sure what it is at first. And then you start to study, and then you start to explore, and so on. So the personal answer is that's why, because society is constructed in a way that information and that path is kept from us. Excuse me. The kind of non-personal answer, to some extent, you have to look at the old information and the old records for that if you want to do it in this current state of consciousness. We'll perhaps talk about other ways of doing that later, but if you want to do it in a normal, waking, ordinary state of consciousness, you look to see people who have asked these questions a long time ago and what they said. And for me, one of the primary kind of elegant and most well-articulated cosmologies comes from the kind of early stroke pre-Christian Gnostic scholars and sages, who many of whom wrote that this universe was created really in error, and it was created outside of a male-female point of balance, and the female aspect of the divine kind of separated out, created something that created a being called the demiurge, for those who don't know. And this god then went about, quite innocently in a way, and created a universe, the one that we live in. And although it follows the blueprint of the divine universe, the perfect universe, there's a fundamental error in it, in that it doesn't have the core harmony. And so our experience of that is what we call entropy, in that everything tends towards an ending. And that isn't the divine blueprint. That's what happens when it's created outside of balance. So the primary fall in Gnostic mythology, and mythology we must bring to mind doesn't necessarily mean fiction at all. It means it's a model, it's a way of thinking about the world that may very well be very literal and that's for the individual to decide. But that model is very useful because it shows us that when the demiurge created, he did it to the blueprint, but he didn't have the male-female harmony. And so we get created from a world that was from the dark feminine shadow, which the ironic result of is that we end up with the dark masculine shadow, and we live in a world run by disturbed men, basically. And that is one description of tracing that root back. And in my discussion of this in an essay earlier this year, or maybe last year, I can't remember. It won't be this year. It was 2010 or 11. You could kind of think of it in that the creator, if you want to think of it in that way, or the divine source, or the underlying architecture, the physics, whatever, knew that this kind of problem had occurred and thought, instead of like reformatting the hard drive and just thinking, oh, well, there was just a fuck up there, so let's get rid of it, he kind of thought, that's interesting. That's really curious what's happened over there. So what I'll do is I'll send in sentient beings who have the perfect algorithm, the perfect male, female, innocent, empowered unity of free will into that corrupted system and see if they can heal it from the inside out. So in Gnostic tracts and in Gnostic teachings, they call them the beautiful or the pure innocent spirits, which just means that there are some beings on earth who came in pure, quite a lot of them, walking around the place, who don't necessarily succumb to the conditioning quite as heavily as everyone else does. And so they spread this kind of awareness. And you could say, well, maybe we know a lot of those people. Maybe it's a lot more common and a lot more normal than we think. And that spreading of illumination, again, is part of a natural process. And as to what that percentage looks like out of 7 billion is anybody's guess. But certainly for me, it's like an innate impulse. And I think it is in a lot of people I meet, to get to the truth of things and wondering why the place doesn't run so well. Again, if you go to these Nag Hammadi texts and go through them, although you have to kind of filter a lot of this Christian terminology out a little bit, when you get to the underlying message of it and you start to realize what is being said, then this issue that we face now, in 2012, is a very old one. And it's happened quite a few times. And it's just coming to a kind of, as Terence McKenna would call it, a concrescence, where a lot of the energies are coming together and are accelerating or speeding up. The old stuff is kind of like beginning to fracture a little bit. But there's some amazing new stuff occurring. And certainly last year on my travels and studies and so on, particularly in meeting people face-to-face, of course, I've never met so many conscious, optimistic, powerful people ever. And that is very, very encouraging to me. And so that's why I think that it is a game at the top level, and it is an experiment to see if something that has got a problem can be fixed from a place of amnesia, basically. Because, of course, when we come in, we don't really know anything. We just have to guess everything and make a sort of best guess with integrity and honor and truth and intelligence as best we can. And that's the game, to see if that can bring through the harmony that wasn't there in the first place. So that is one cosmology, and there are many, but that's one that I quite like, and I think has a lot to teach us, even if it's not the only one. I'm not proposing that as the answer, but it's certainly something that is worthy of study and gives a lot of interesting avenues for exploration.
Now, I'm curious, in this model of I'm familiar with the idea of the demiurge and the sort of faulty universe, if you will, or the flawed universe. Now, a lot of what Sync shows, for certain people, Sync shows that it is a perfect universe, that if you can show this sort of divine order and everything, then we already are in the perfect universe, and that it's not. flawed. Is this something that a lot of people, a conclusion that a lot of people come to? Now, I wonder if, again, it's that sort of as above, so below, as within, so without. As you start doing that inner work, is that sort of view of the outside world, are we repairing it? Are we, while we're doing the inner work, are we also, almost like Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits, are we repairing the sort of flaws in the grand architect's plans by just as the universe?
Yeah, the architect's plan is perfect, if we can use that word. That's the way I feel. The design is supreme, and again, as you say, you don't have to look very far into the sort of synchro-mystical nature of this thing to determine that. And like I say in my little piece in your book, just look into the head of a sunflower and you start to realize there's something pretty amazing occurring. And it, as you say, fractally at every level that occurs with humans, with plants, with nature, with design, with art, with everything. The design itself is good. The problem was the execution of that design, if you like. The person who actually constructed it did it from a place of ego, did it from a place of thinking, I'm the big man, and this is my universe. And so whenever that happens, as indeed in our own personal lives, everything tends towards its own end, entropy, the third law of thermodynamics or whatever. And we accept that as well. That's just the way it is. And it is to some extent. It's hard to argue that. Many physicists, I'm sure, could line up and pretty much persuade anybody that that's the way it kind of functions. But the point is, as you say, that as you start to see that and you bring your own harmony into it, you can sort of revivify that design and say, okay, the design is good, but as conscious co-creators, as aspects of the divine, which I firmly know that we are, you have the ability to bring that harmony back to any point in the design that you make contact with, whether in abstract thinking, whether emotionally, whether physically, whether in your food, whether in your journeys, whether in your music. Everything you do, every time you contact the design, you have the capacity to reharmonize it and to bring it back into a state of natural coherence that potentially wasn't there in the first place. So, yes, you can see the patterns, but the execution of those patterns and the articulation of them only really works from a position of harmony. So that's why it's kind of like always a good result in the end, because you can't really mess that pattern up, because it just fizzles out if it's done from a place of decoherence. If it's done from a place of harmony, it tends towards self-sustaining practice, just like in permaculture or something. It tends to find its own equilibrium, and that's what this is about. It's about reintegrating opposites, bringing light and shadow together, and understanding that the cracks in the world and the weird stuff in the world, that we don't like, is fixable. But no one else is going to come along and do it. The whole point is that we do it in ourselves, and the universe learns from us just as much as we learn from it.
Beautifully said. We only have a few minutes left in the live broadcast. Would you like, if you're willing to follow us over into the after show, glad we do that. But maybe you want to address your upcoming book in the last few minutes here?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, over 2011, the second half of 2011, I was pretty solidly writing, and I've finished my book, which is called The Unfoldment, and it will be released in spring. And there will be obviously updates on the website and stuff, and the publishers will put their own materials out, and I'll be talking about that and going to different events and so on. But yeah, the book really is a sort of synthesis of a lot of the things I talk about, and my experiment with the book is to try and bring that information to people who know nothing about any of this. So although old hands and wise old wizards wandering about the planet might pick it up and find it useful, hopefully, certainly my satisfaction and my fulfillment is that's easy to do that. But what's really an exciting challenge is to get, the woman you stood next to in the dentist's waiting room to pick it up and have a look at it and actually take something valuable away from it. So it is pretty comprehensive, but it's also very approachable as well. So that's been my intention with this, to try and, strike a chord with people who know that things are changing and maybe feel a bit uncertain about that, and really put empowerment into people's hands. So it is a very transformative book, but it's about power as well, and claiming that back for ourselves, really, rather than imagining that it's something that is bestowed upon us or is something that exists outside of us. It's claiming that within ourselves. So that's what it's about.
When the going gets weird, the weird go pro, huh?
I like it.
Here's ending. Well, a quote from your piece in the Sync book. Towards the end, you say, "Our life is a journey. We illustrate it with our unique and miraculous stories." And we were talking about the death card at the beginning. And this past Christmas, I was given a new set of tarot cards. It's called the Wildwood. And instead of a medieval or Egyptian symbol set, they use like a pagan or Celtic symbol set. And for the death card, it's called the Journey. And I just thought that was
nice. Yeah, I like it. Very, very appropriate.
Yeah.
So how much time we got?
Got a couple minutes to wrap it up.
Okay, so can I bring this up? At the end of Brazil, is he? How do we put it? Is he getting out of the sort of trap of? Is he sort of come through the dark unveiling and he's gone inside to do the interior work, or is he? As there's so much out there. It's the idea of this is mind control, and you're creating a sort of MK Ultra like altar or prison in your own mind. What do you have hope for Sam Lowry at the end of Brazil? Where do you stand on him?
Yeah, I do have hope for him. I think it's reality tunnels. I think from the reality tunnel of Brazil, which is essentially modern day Britain come to life in the real world, that is the reality tunnel, and he's fucked basically. From a different reality tunnel, he's completely understood what's going on around him, and the character played by De Niro is his own hero, and it's only where he loses faith that dissipates, really. And I think he starts to realise through love, to give it a nice ending, that there's another way of doing it. So I think the parallel reality tunnels are both as relative and as real as each other. So it depends through which lens you're looking at, and certainly Gilliam likes to always switch that about. So you're left with that question mark, but I think it's very conscious question mark. I think he's saying that's up to you what you want to do, So both those realities split off.
And that's up to you what to do.
Hey guys, this is Alan. The following is what they call the Green Room for 42 minutes. This is the after the live broadcast, the Skype conversation. This one is with Neil Kramer. I just want to give a heads up. The first 7 minutes, the sound quality is not fantastic, but it's really worth listening to. I didn't want to cut it out because I think just what Neil says is so worth listening to. So there's a little hiss there, but get through it. After about 7 minutes, it sounds a lot better. And we got about another 40 minutes here with Neil. It's really amazing material. I hope you enjoy it. We were left with the idea of having some hope for Sam to make it out. Now this brings me to something I wanted to touch on, and maybe this is a sort of a foolish question in and of itself, because it comes back to that dichotomy of right or wrong, real or unreal, within, without. But I just want to, you touched on the idea of the Gnostic mythos, so that brings us to things like archons, plant spirits, ayahuasca serpents. all these sort of outside, perhaps, entities that are of a different density, let's call it, or dimension,
Yeah.
are they literal entities that we can interact with? Are these different worlds that we can travel to through different shamanic practices? Are they real worlds, or are they only metaphors for our interior landscape?
Well, for me, there's no difference between
Right.
a rock falling on my head and a metaphor in my mind. They're both completely real. What makes one feel more real than another is its density. So if you're dense and you have an interaction with something that's less dense, then we tend to call that less real. And I think that's what's beginning to change, and people are beginning to wise up to that. So if you change your density, if you imbibe some sacred medicine, shall we say, and you change your conscious agility and you move into another realm, the realness of that place amplifies, seemingly, because you're moving in a space where you're at the same density as those things. So if you communicate with a fourth density consciousness, which is a very frequent and easy, common thing to do in normal life, it's just that we don't know we're doing it very often. But if you do it consciously, then that is real. And it only becomes unreal to the mainstream when you come back here, because it's no longer accessible anymore. So the whole thing, this whole model of densities is totally enfolded. So they've got these 7 Russian dolls all encompassing each other, and we're there kind of nearly in the middle of it. And so everything that we do affects the whole ecology, the whole thing affects everything else. And that's why ultra-terrestrial intelligences give a shit about us, because what we do changes things for everybody. Now, it doesn't have quite the same dramatic effect for them as it does to second density consciousnesses that we kind of are giving a pretty hard time to on this planet at the moment. But it certainly sends ripples out. So I think rather than saying is it literal or is it metaphorical, it's like, how dense is it? What is your density? You know, and that changes from what position of consciousness, what configuration of energy you're using. So a dream in my sleep tonight is just as real as what I'm doing now. It's just that when my vantage point shifts, my judgment about the reality of that event changes. And that's the only thing that moves, not how real is it or how unreal is it. Everything is real.
Absolutely, beautifully said. It's the, as you quote in your book, it's the cluster of consecutive worlds. I love that phrase.
Yes. It is, it's exactly that, and it's, you know, I've kind of showed a video a couple of times in some of my workshops where it's Carl Sagan describing what a 3D world looks like to two-dimensional beings, this flatland world. You can see it on YouTube where he's got these little squares and shapes and stuff. And you can't really see the 4D from the 3D. You cannot do that. You can abstract it and think about it. And so we call it like archetypes and resonators and conscious mythologies and you know, birth stories and so on and so forth. But really what it is something that we can only theorize about. You have to get outside of yourself to see it. That's the trick, of course.
So when you had said, you know, this idea of the, you had the number 7, like with chakras, this sort of 7-fold model of reality. Something that I come back to, and I believe this is what you were getting at with, you know, bringing it down to where you are now. Making, I believe you had said something like, if you can't make this gnosis work for you in your everyday life, then ultimately it doesn't work for you. It's not benefiting you or working in your favor.
That's right.
If you can't
bring
it down.
That's why old-fashioned academic philosophy is very limited in terms of its practical utility, because it's all very nice to sit there and theorize about X, Y, and Z, but if that's not actually evolving the way you brush your teeth, then it's arguably not very relevant. So I do think it's important to be able to map those things to the micro and the macro absolutely at the intimate level, yeah.
So with that in mind, should we be looking, instead of progressing necessarily through the 7 layers, it's more about incorporating more and more layers. So the grocery store level never goes away. We just learn to incorporate further, dig a little deeper and get more knowledge and a wider understanding. But the sort of 3D, if you will, that's not going away. You're just wanting to incorporate more into, correct?
Yes, that's right. They unfold each other, these densities, these layers, these dimensions, whatever you want to call it. The mystics that I have studied in the past, they call them spheres and realms and heavens and all these different terms, but they unfold each other. Each one, however, does appear to have specific resonance for a specific lesson or a specific teaching, and the third density is very much characterized by self-awareness. So self-awareness, very much represents this sort of plateau of attainment here, and when you're in the third density, that is your goal, is to develop this self-awareness to a sort of supreme level. And that, as you say, incorporates a number of previous densities. So that means you don't suddenly start treating the 2D like shit. You don't kick the cat around the room and sort of just set everything on fire in the forest because you don't care because you're an elevated entity. That does not constitute self-awareness. So yes, it means you become an honourable person. It means you become somebody with integrity in everything that you do. So how you bring that into the grocery store, into the waiting room, or into driving your car is that everything you do becomes imbued with this consciousness, of course, this awareness and this vigilance, but also it becomes kind of like the old samurai way of being, where you treat every day like with the sort of highest sort of respect and as an exercise in self-expression and self-control. So it's as if, God is watching you and he's saying, right, let's see how this guy behaves today. So do you just sort of sit around and, eat pizza and watch zombie movies, which, I do that every now and again, but or do you actually bring whatever you're doing into a sphere of heightened awareness, and do you bring that quality into the very mundane and prosaic things that we do? And the more you do that, the more you realize that you kind of like, it's your responsibility to guide that consciousness of everything around you. So my model of awakening, my understanding of awakening is that there are a critical mass of like nodal points. So there's always necessarily a low percentage of people who go around doing this stuff, who basically serve as what David Bohm used to call the pilot wave for everything else. So you're pioneering this, and it's a pretty thankless job in a way. There's not much in it for anybody, but it's an impulse in people who are interested in metaphysics and mysticism and spirituality. It's an impulse, it's innate, and you uncover it in yourself, and it's not really something that has necessarily, as you would say, a reward, but it's something that you do. And the ecology of that, to use that word again, is that it affects everything around you. So just like, if you walk into a room and there's someone in there smiling, it immediately affects the consciousness in that room, and the smile affects your tendency to smile and your tendency to share and your tendency to be open. And in the same way, being conscious has the same effect. So if you're conscious, you will magnetize consciousness to you, and you'll make it more appropriate for other people to feel that they can do the same thing. You give them the confidence for them to do it themselves. So that's the beauty of this, in that it's kind of like a dove virus that goes through the system and spreads this awareness.
Beautiful. Doug, I know, likes to refer to this as the contagion. It's like you just referred to it as the virus. It's like we are instilling a positive virus into the meme stream.
A virus, yeah. That's why I.
But viewed from the point of view of the ego, you know, this looks nasty. This is an illness. You know, this is trying to undo the empire.
Well, I mean, I have never consciously sought to undo the empire, really. I don't really even give it much credence, and I don't think it's particularly fascinating anymore. It was very important as part of my self-initiation, but not anymore. And I think everybody goes through different aspects of that, and certainly some people it becomes their personal undertaking and choice to spend a lifetime studying that, but that takes a toll on the individual. I think that you when you start to realize that the fourth density is characterized by this like non-physical energetic being where manifestation is very immediate, you need to have your ego in check. And so if you find yourself in a space where manifestation, as in a dream, a lucid dream, is immediate, if your demons and your purity aren't in order, then you're going to create a hell zone pretty damn quickly. You're going to create all manner of weirdness, very, very unpleasant, before you know it. And so part of the purpose of the third density is to get your shit together, is to get your chops in order, you know, is to learn your scales on the guitar, so you know everything that you're doing. And that's, you know, it's kind of a beautiful process in a way, in that it's reflected and it's mirrored in everything that you do and everything that is around you. So the whole point of temporality here, of time and of cause and effect, is really to show you the effects of your consciousness on what happens around you, and the quality of your life and the quality of your relationships with people. How much love do you have? You know, how well do you sleep at night? You know, all that stuff. That's to some degree showing you what your consciousness is doing. So that ego thing starts to get knocked out pretty fast the further you go down this, and it's of no interest to me whatsoever how that looks to anyone else. It's just how it is, and you just cannot progress with ego on this path. You hit a brick wall pretty fast. So you either go into it directly to fix that yourself and look at it and realize that it is something that you need, an ego, but it has a particular role, and its role is as a caretaker, really, not as a captain. And that's cool, and it's important. And if the caretaker has a few days off, you soon know about it when everything starts to go smelly and odd and weird, you know? So the ego has a role, but it's not the role that we thought it was. So really what we're doing is repositioning that energy to do something else. And quite frankly, when the ego realizes that, it's much happier. So it doesn't want to feel like it's getting demoted, or it'll fight against that. But when it realizes you're not trying to destroy it or discredit it, it works with you and you work with it. You're no longer in conflict.
Now, you said something pretty interesting there, the idea of the caretaker. And only, I'm not trying to relate everything back to movies, but only because this is...
You synchromistic people, you always say that, and it's just not true, but go on.
Actually, I'm not one of the ones who brings it back to movies. It's not really my thing.
I know what you're going to do. Go ahead, Alan. That's what you're going to do.
Well, I do think, ultimately, I'll say this quickly, is I do think I'm glad that there are people out there who are doing it, because basically, if we try and, for many people, when I try and introduce them to a topic, if I bring up a 15th century alchemical text, they roll their eyes and they immediately turn off. And yet if I say, hey, did you see this movie, they can relate to it, and you progress the conversation a lot faster. So
very wise, sir, very wise.
Yeah, I think very often, I think there is like I said, it's a smart move to bring it into that sense. But in this case, I just happened to be talking to somebody recently about where they think there's a very strong correlation between Stanley Kubrick's movie 2001 and Stanley Kubrick's movie The Shining. He feels they were made as parallel movies. And so he has set up an arrangement to watch them side by side. And when I watched this, what I realized, now he didn't get out of it I didn't get out of it what he thought I was going to. We got two different things out of it. But what I got out of it was that The Shining, as dark as it is a very, I think we lost Neil.
No, I'm still here.
Oh, okay. The Shining is a very almost uplifting story. It is the dark unveiling. They go through hell, but then come out the other side. And I thought of the father, what's his name, Jack Nicholson character, as basically that old law, that demiurge sort of father that need to be swayed, and that he was essentially this ego figure. And of course, you just mentioned the ego should be the caretaker. And what does he learn at the end of the movie but that he's always been the caretaker? It's like saying, remember your role.
The photograph, etc.
Yeah, remember your role. You're the caretaker.
Well, let me just stop you there for a moment. Let me just stop you there for a moment. I've just got to tell you this before we go any further.
Yeah.
Last month, I went to the Timberline Lodge where the external shots for The Shining were shot.
Oh, it's amazing.
Yes, which is not hugely surprising, living where I do, near Hood River in Oregon, but that lodge has always been very, very special image to me. And one of the, things that I've had on my list for a long time is to go and visit the hotel where that was shot, the external shots at least, and some of the entrance shots. And it's virtually the same today. It's very old, it's very eerie, it's very, very isolated. And just flying back from New York a couple of days ago, we flew over Mount Hood, which is where it's on the slopes of, just in the evening, and I saw the lodge lit up. And it is a very unusual place. And just as you bring that up, I just have to throw that in.
Doug, you were trying to say?
Oh, I was trying to say that Jack is torn between, his duty to his family and his duty to consensuality as the caretaker of, the world as it is, the dog-eat-dog world, where he's running the hotel in the absence of, as the caretaker, he's got to make sure the furnace keeps working and that reality functions as the Empire would have it function, but that conflicts with his role as father and husband.
Yeah, it does, and it starts to kind of like show other aspects with Danny, who, is operating in fourth density consciousness, basically, along with the black guy, I forget his name, Hong Kong Phooey man. It's really interesting. So that particular thing for me balances out with the Shelley Duvall character, who represents normality, a good human being, basically. So you've got this little trinity in the family that represents, the existing, the old, the new, the classical, the archetypal, and it is interesting. It's a phenomenal movie as well, by the way.
Yeah, indeed.
And the book is actually pretty good too. And so you were talking about alchemical text and people rolling their eyes. I really think Stephen King is doing a great service where he's able to bring all this really deep psychological transformation to, I don't want to say it, he puts it in the language of the everyday people where it's interesting to read, and they might not get that the first time they read it. I know I did. I read Stephen King in high school, but then later you see how much is really there.
Neil, in your ARC conference talk, I saw that on YouTube. You bring up at the beginning William S. Burroughs and the idea that he was able to, as a fiction writer, he was able to inject so much more that, basically get away with saying things or introducing topics that you wouldn't be able to get away with as an academic. I wonder why it is that, people are reluctant to hear some of these ideas. Even, nowadays, you have this very big science fiction fandom, these people who have comic conventions and all these things. And yet,
we'll talk about Philip K. Dick, Alan, where, basically his science fiction is really well received, but then his exegesis, where it seems like he's taking on a Gnostic mythology, people start wondering if he isn't a nutter.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, I've seen a recording of a talk where he gave, where he's saying, these are the experiences I had, and everyone's looking at each other in the room like, what is this guy talking about? So why
but
is
you
it that...
put it into fiction and they just eat it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's the old idea of cognitive dissonance, where if you presented with something like Brazil or Blade Runner or The Shining or whatever, Star Wars, Dawn of the Dead, anything like that, you can explore these different scenarios of how people's lives can radically shift and transform, and how societies can change, in such unbelievable ways. But to actually start to imagine that's happening down the street, or it's happening in Queens in New York, or it's happening in Portland in Oregon, people feel funny about that because they're not really in a psychological place to deal with it. So I think the interesting thing that's happening now is that as we move into the beginning of the 21st century, people are more ready for that, I think. I think even from, the 1970s and the 1980s, there's been a huge shift. And I think people are kind of, to put it bluntly, they're kind of like, well, there's not much to lose really. Let's give something else a go because this sucks. So let's try something different. And there's a lot of collapses and a lot of meltdowns in people's personal lives as well. I have seen and noticed, and people have volunteered that information to me about their own lives. And the crisis that brings to the life is often just kind of like gift wrapping of something pretty precious, really. And that's again the silver lining to the cloud, in that the same people will come back and say, remember that awful thing that I was telling you about? Well, because of that, something marvelous happened, something amazing happened. So, they got divorced, or they lost a job, or they went bankrupt, or something, pretty shocking that would knock anybody. But that crisis was a fundamental realization, and the universe seems to do that on a pretty regular basis, and that it throws these little traumas and these little weird, nuggets into our life. And if you can just have, again, the perspective to stand aside from yourself, if not above yourself, at least just see it from a sort of third-person perspective, you realise that there's something in there. And I have this kind of idea that the worse the crisis is, the more you've been ignoring that voice for a long time. So if you knew that you hated being an accountant, say, and you're stuck at it for 30 years, the crisis that finally knocks you onto a path of self-realization will be all the more dramatic and, difficult to ignore. Whereas if you listen to that voice early on, you can make adjustments, you can make the necessary arrangements to kind of shift more harmoniously with that, and watch the patterns and listen to the clues that lie in your environment. And I've certainly found that, and I've done both. I've had things that have kind of knocked me on my ass, big style, and then I've seen, as I've wised up from that, I've seen the little clues out there. I thought, oh, hang on a second, yeah, this situation that I could ignore, which would make things immediately a little bit easier for me, I'm actually not going to, because I see the sort of meta-narrative now. I understand, so I plunge myself into it, and I'll go right into the middle of it as an experiment, even though it might be unpleasant, and just kind of stand there, with a little bit of defiance, but not egotistical, more sort of, like a warrior who'll just think, right, well, come on then, bring it on, let's see what you've got. And if you can just remain centered in that, you can usually, deflect whatever difficulties come, but absorb the teaching behind it. So I see that more and more and more happening with people, not just sort of conscious students of spirituality or whatever, but also just regular people who seem to volunteer this. Just sat on the plane the other day with this lady, total stranger next to me, and she tells me a story, and it's the same pattern. I just hear it over and over.
So what do you make of that? So, like, in the second part of your piece, you talk about telepathy and how you connect to that field and then take in, the idea of something that is temporally coming in the future. Do you intuit the future a little bit? or do you read this darkness that you're seeing around you as a larger coming darkness, or is that even relevant to you?
Not sure I know what you mean, but I think that kind of connection to the field, the fourth density field of, this informational layer that is atemporal, so you can see backwards, forwards, left and right, whatever. That happens all the time, I think. Like, not just like, oh, we're all a bit psychic, we all know that, but I think it happens at a profound level all the time, but we filter it out. We actually block it out. So the trick with this kind of field connection, this field uplink or whatever, is creating stillness, is kind of getting the static out of the way. So it's just like a radio station where the signal is very weak from the fourth density because it's a very subtle thing when you're a dense meat sack like we are. So you have to kind of shift out of that, and the way to do it is to create this extraordinary stillness, and we all know there's different ways of achieving that. And when you do that, just like with the radio, you can then turn up the volume on that weak signal. You can't do that when there's a lot of static, because obviously it would just melt you. But once you isolate the signal and create stillness and silence around it, you can then amplify it. And those are the moments where you can look around the corner and you can peep around the next series of events, and it's kind of like deja vu, but instead of you riding it as it just spontaneously happens, you actually push it out, you actually instigate it and push it out, your field of vision, instead of being, your immediate environment and your immediate few seconds, pushes out a little bit further. And the more stillness you create, the more silence you create, the bigger that field becomes. So your sphere of influence, your circle of knowing, as I call it in the book, extends out. And that requires a certain amount of power, a certain amount of personal, sort of psychic accrual. And if you're really busy and you're doing loads of things, and you're juggling 2 jobs and you've got some kids and there's a lot going on, you're not really going to have the bandwidth for that. So you have to create circumstances for yourself where that's possible. So that energy is energy. You're using energy, drinking a glass of milk, just like you're using energy when you're dreaming. It's all the same thing, but you have to choose what to do with it. It's like in the Castaneda books, semi-fictional perhaps, but whatever. The character of Don Juan talks about the sorcerers of antiquity, and he says they were like extremely aggressive and protective about how they would protect their energy source. So they would like wear certain colours and only eat certain foods and only go out on certain days and stuff. Also they could store up this energy charge so they could make these non-ordinary conscious manoeuvres. And it's a little bit like that, but I mean, I kind of love the world too much to go to those lengths right now, and I think my path is one of engagement rather than hermitage, but
and so does that mean that, I know you speak at length about shamanism, but part of that is to achieve the non-ordinary states of consciousness, they take some sort of psychedelic substance oftentimes.
Yeah.
And where that's something that we've talked about a lot as this show has progressed. The benefits of that, and then the potential harms of that. How do you feel about that?
Boy, that's a big question. That's a big topic. There's lots of different ways to approach that. Concisely as I can, I would say that it's the approaching substance, imbibing substances to accelerate or catapult or progress you a little bit faster than you feel that you're currently doing is okay, as long as you have this kind of supreme diligence and discipline and respect and you know what you're doing. Again though, you soon realize that if you start to create like putting training wheels on your bicycle, if you can't do it without the training wheels, if you can't walk around without the crutches, it's pretty crap really. And so it's a bit like the sort of wizard who needs his magic cloak and his magic necklace and his magic staff and all this paraphernalia, and if you steal all that stuff over him, he's just like a little old man in a grey cloak. You know, the true sage, the true mystic, doesn't need anything, doesn't need any of that stuff whatsoever. So although it opens your mind, your conscious mind, to the possibilities, and sometimes it can be useful to affirm that yes, reality is a very fragile construct, it's really just usually confirming things that people kind of already knew. Actually, what you can achieve in those places in terms of your growth is very limited in some ways. It's more to persuade people that yes, this is fragile, this is only one way of doing things, and there are many others. And for a lot of people I know who have had first-time experiences and then gone along and done another half dozen journeys, that's been the big win, and there hasn't been anything massively useful after that. There are other techniques and aspects, of course, like for self-healing and for cleaning out, and the sort of ayahuasca, drill sergeant aspect, which really like scoops you out and shows you your own shit big style. There's definitely some value in that, but again, if somebody's in a bit of a dodgy place, or there's some kind of bad wiring going on, the very worst thing you can do is take these plant medicines. The very worst thing you can do is that. You know yourself, I think, whoever you are, whatever you're doing, whether it's wise to do it or not. And again, going back to what some of our forefathers, like in recent times, like Robert Anton Wilson said, you know, it isn't a dietary thing, it is medicinal. And I think if you just use that little mantra, you can't go far wrong. So, like, if I have a cracking headache, I don't really like to take pills, but I will do every now and again, and it gets me to where I need to be. But I'm certainly not going to work that into my diet every day, because it's going to affect my body's overall ability to heal itself on an ongoing basis. And similarly with psychedelics, if that is your only pathway into higher or lower densities, then fine, but you're going to disable yourself really on an ongoing basis. So you use it really where you get stuck, and when there's stuckness, then maybe think about that, and it can be extremely useful. And there's no doubt about it, they are gateways, but if you're not disciplined consciously, and if your mental apparatus isn't clear and clean, then when you go into that space, there's not much you can actually do that's very productive or integral or wise. You just kind of flap about, really. And that's all very exciting. You can come back with a pretty good tale to tell, whether you say it to yourself or to your friends, but so what? So you have to do a lot of work here to be able to do anything there.
Yeah, absolutely. Very well said. Doug, I know you wanted to start winding down. Was there, did you want to hit on something else?
No. I noticed in the news that there's a conspiracy story about Obama taking trips to Mars as a young man.
Oh.
Yeah, just to throw that in at the end. Nice one.
Yeah. You know what's odd though is, I swear to you, at 4 o'clock this morning, I found myself unable to sleep again, even though I've been having strange bouts of insomnia.
Yeah, my sleep's been messed up as well, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so what I was going to say was that I found myself last night actually thinking about that guy and thinking about the danger, like, where do we find a balance between respecting everyone's has something valid to bring to the table, and at what point do we say, like, hey, here's some guy who's going on lectures saying that I saw Obama teleporting to Mars. You know, where do we find this balance? It was just something that, like, as I found myself awake at 4:30 in the morning, unable to sleep, it popped into my head. Now, we could possibly go down that route, but I actually, if you've also been noticing a sleep weirdness, I want to ask, I've been reluctant to speak of this, but particularly in the last few weeks, months at most, I've noticed people feeling like, I feel like everyone has been really on edge. Everyone that I'm interacting with, and even the quote-unquote, enlightened ones, I feel like there's a lot of sort of hostility and struggling with egos going on right now. And I wonder if this is part of that, if there is anything to 2012, if it's not people really struggling with this shift of energies, or I don't know if I'm the only one who's witnessing this, but I feel like I've noticed a sort of really increased, amped up hostility in a very short period of time. Has anyone else noticed that?
Doug, do you want to comment on that? I've been talking enough, I think.
The only thing that I'm seeing is kind of this looming darkness. It feels like, they're relaunching the Titanic, and, I want to believe that this time it'll make it to New York. But there's, and then in my own little tiny micro oracles, in my workplace, I just see kind of this Brazil-like fascist empire takeover of something beautiful, and I'm trying to figure out how I'm supposed to respond to that.
Yeah, well, I do agree. You can see it. You can definitely see it, and I don't think you're out of line saying that it is. There's some hostility in that. I think that's important to say. Whatever we see out there, and I think for me, as I said, going back to what we were talking about earlier, the more you've ignored your own shadow stuff, and we can just put that in a very plain way as well. When negative things happen to us, so to speak, as young men and women, we create a set of response wiring to make sure that doesn't happen again. And usually the problem is that it's inappropriately laid down at the time, and we go through our life with that response wiring, and it shapes us and restricts us in ways that are no longer appropriate, especially when you start to work on consciousness. And if that wiring's still in place, it's getting triggered a lot more now, I think. So people who have been putting off doing some old rewiring jobs about key things about love, in particular, and being able to love and being able to be loved, and also about friendships, and also about purpose and meaning and fulfillment and happiness and sexuality, very fundamental things that affect us all. If that stuff has been buried for such a long time, I think one of the things that is happening on the planet right now, and goodness knows how, but you could just say, well, it's energy. You can always say that. There's some sort of energy that's exposing that, and those things are coming to the surface, and the hostility arises, in my view, because they're old things from when we were kids, and so our response to them, just like the sort of replicants in Blade Runner, there you go, there's a movie reference. The replicants respond like children, don't they? And it's kind of endearing, but they can also be very violent as well, because they have this very immature emotional response. And so even though we're very intellectual and very articulate and so on and so forth, our old wiring that was laid down when we were 6 and 7 and 8, when that gets triggered, our response is very hostile and is very awkward and ungainly. And I think you can see that happening. You can see that old stuff getting triggered, especially by people who consume a lot of mainstream media and believe what happens on CNN and stuff. Those people are really exposing themselves to some pretty sort of, medieval therapy at the moment, where it's like, you've got a toothache in 1560 and somebody just knocks you out with an axe handle. That's the kind of therapy that's available in the mainstream. So you have to go to more elevated and compassionate and sophisticated methods of doing that. So, there's a lot of emotional aspects to a lot of this work, and I go into that in the book and stuff. You can't just reside and take sanctuary in the intellect in these times. It really does get very physical, very emotional, very sexual. All those things are intertwined, and so we can't hide in our bookishness in this respect, and neither can anyone else. So it requires a lot of courage, this stuff, and I think people who lack that are getting exposed at the moment, and that, I include myself in that. We all get tweaked by that every now and again.
Sure, we're all in this together, absolutely.
totally, yeah.
With Hermes Trismegistus, there's no real difference between the outside and the inside. So not just as above, so below, but as within, so without. So the wise student realizes that those dark unveilings really are a reflection of what's inside. And that's the value of it. And the transformative aspect is once you realize that, you don't get hung up in this kind of negative vortex where you just think, well, all is lost and the Empire's kind of supremely powerful and there's very little we can do and we're all kind of in a bit of a up the creek without a paddle situation. It's not like that. It's a very classical kind of Hindu realization, really. So that's what that is. And it can take many forms and many aspects, very practical geopolitical study and very esoteric study in terms of secret societies and non-human intelligence and so on and so forth. So those different layers of the shadow, again, if one can keep still and focused and balanced and strong going through that, it does lead to a good place. And as I say, it's a very archetypal journey, really. It's the fool's journey in tarot, if you want to put it that way, and that you start from that point of ignorance and you start to realize that everything isn't as we thought it was. And initially, that feels bad. But after a little while, after a little study and a little kind of soul searching, you start to get the attainment, the conscious attainment that is actually part of your own journey. It's not just stuff out there on the platform of the world that's happening and you're looking at it. It's actually part of you. I think that's the spiritual value to it.
Wonderful.
So then, does the individual transform the empire by transforming themselves, or is that irrelevant? You know, the empire is always going to be the empire, and the individual needs to go on their journey and break through.
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it? I think that brings one to the very deep and important topic of free will. And essentially, without free will, you are at the mercy of the empire, and everything that you do, every time you vote and, fill out.
Talk shoes. Recorded live.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil. Welcome all to another week of 42 Minutes, this one being episode 13. And again, my usual co-host Will is out on sync assignments, and I'm joined by Alan Abadessa and a very special guest this week, which I will let Alan introduce.
Thank you. It's good to be back with you, Doug. And today we have with us Neil Kramer, who I'm just really honored to have with us. He was kind of to contribute to the Sync book and join us today. So, Neil, welcome to the call.
Hey, guys. Good to be here. Thanks for inviting me along.
Absolutely. Now, Doug, you started this off with a quote about death, and that's because this is the 13th episode, and 13 being death in the tarot, correct?
This is correct. Yes. So the 13th episode, I think this means that we're talking about death this evening. And this is interesting that usually the show comes to you in the morning, and this episode is coming to you at night. So is the death card, what does that mean? Is it a literal death, or is it a transformation? And that's what the show is doing this week.
Absolutely. And that's something we had started to mention the movie Brazil last week. It came up. And the ending of the movie is something Doug and I have discussed as to what actually happens. And
before we get into that, should we say, you know, did you... Well, first, I just want to say how much I appreciated your piece in the Sync book, Neil. I thought it was fabulous.
You're welcome. Thank you.
How did you, Alan, as the editor of the book, how did you get in touch with Neil? How did this happen?
A form for the IRS, or go and get your driving license or whatever. You're playing the Empire's game, really. And if you're hoping that Ron Paul's going to make everything better, or there's going to be some sort of Marxist revolution or something, you're still playing the Empire's game, and it looks rather, difficult. So the transformative element of that is in realizing from a very high level that the Empire serves a kind of purpose of what you might call as a negative attractor. So it pushes out the polarity of conflict to a point where it creates change, it accelerates change. So in Hindu terms, many people would be familiar with the Yuga cycles, where you're at a point where there's more negative polarity than there is positive. So from a human face on the map type perspective, that looks a bit bleak, and you might think, well, it might be nice to live in a time where it's very positive, the golden age or whatever. But actually, it's where that Kali Yuga cycle completes, where you reach optimum negative polarity, that you also reach optimal potential for change. So really, it's kind of like a game in that even the Empire is playing that game as well. And strictly speaking, there are no good guys and bad guys. But again, that's a transpersonal view. And, if you're getting a boot in your face and your teeth knocked out, you do well to keep that view in mind, of course. So if you're right up against the edges and you feel that abrasion, then you quickly forget that. But if you can create a space for contemplation, and you can zoom out from your own personal affairs for a moment, then you begin to see that this empire, the only thing that's unusual about it is that it's kind of plugged into Maya, the illusion of form. And what was designed as a teaching mechanism, i.e. to penetrate the illusion of form, has been sort of hijacked a little bit. And that Maya construct, which I call the distortion, has become very inorganic. So a few thousand years ago, I think it was very natural. And now it isn't. It's very synthetic, and it's very much conditioned and programmed and constructed and so on. And yet again, although that seems...
I first heard Neil on Red Ice, I guess like 2 years ago, and then I followed some of his work and was just really impressed. And I just I guess it was towards the end when we, as I've mentioned a number of times, the Sync book just sort of snowballed from a very innocent little idea of, hey, what if some of us all wrote 10 pages to snowballing into a real something. And when we decided to expand the book and a little bit more towards the end, I just reached out to Neil and asked him if he would contribute one of his, he writes wonderful essays on his website, that's neilkramer.com, and I asked him if he would be willing to contribute one of those essays to our book, and he said yes.
Great.
Now, the reason I mentioned Brazil is because one of the first times I heard Neil speak was in a Red Ice episode where the sort of topic was the movie Brazil, or he used that as a launching point. And I thought maybe Neil would want to speak to that a little bit of how, a few things, essentially maybe we can get to the ending of the story of do we escape, what is quote-unquote escape, death in the Tarot also being change, what is the true transformative process, but also maybe a little bit of where I'd really like you to start. I think many in synchronicity who have come to really study synchronicity got into it and through what Neil calls a dark unveiling. And I was wondering if, Neil, if you would introduce that aspect a little bit to start us off.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the dark unveiling I presented various models and ways of thinking about the world over the past 5, 6, 7 years. And one of the stages in one's personal awakening process, if I can use that rather grand word, or expanding consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, one of those stages is undoubtedly an unveiling stage, where as you begin to realize that there is more to life than the mainstream consensus reality tunnel suggests there is, one of the most intriguing aspects of that initially is the dark unveiling. That is the sort of shadow side, which is to some degree, alchemically speaking, a reflection of what's inside us. But it means conspiracy to most people. But as you begin to push through that, you realize that it is a very archetypal shadow, as Jung might describe it, in that it's everything that is unconscious in the world. That does mean all the kind of psyops and destructive events and unpleasantness around the world. And people get drawn into looking at the sort of David Icke and Alex Jones territory and realize that a lot of this stuff is real. It's not really open to sort of debate and whether it's actual or not anymore. I think with any sort of degree of personal study, which, there's quite a lot of that required, you soon come to the conclusion that there is a sort of cabal of people going around trying to steer events. And what I have found is that group of people, rather than it just being like the Illuminati or the New World Order or some kind of slightly superficial layer, is really what I would describe as the empire, which is one empire, which is unceasing really since about 8,000 years ago at minimum. And so there's always been the empire, and it was Egyptian and Roman and Mongol and British and American, and it's all the same thing. And when you look at the dark unveiling of life, whatever level you go to and however deeply you want to penetrate that, what you're really doing is you are investigating the sort of forensic trail of the empire and how it's moved through human society over the millennia. And you come to a point where you realize that not only is it actual and it has veracity, as I say, but it's also something that is very old. And I think a lot of pure conspiracy researchers kind of neglect to go into that in any great detail. And a few people may say, oh yeah, there's Sumerian aspects and, off-world aspects and so on, but they don't really go into it. And I think that even looking at the modern sort of mediaplex, which I know is quite a heavy feature of synchro-mystic study, if you like, you can start to see the sort of little tentacles of the empire, and it is very fascinating. But the real juice of it, the real value of it, is that there comes a point where you realize that it's actually an aspect of yourself, and it's actually a reflection of consciousness. And that leads to a rather classical realization, which is that, as in alchemy,